Captain Dana Reynolds had learned to bite her tongue during briefings. 8 years of commanding tank units through urban warfare in Iraq and classified operations in Syria had taught her when to speak and when to stay silent. But as she sat in the back row of the mission briefing room at Forward Operating Base Blackwater, watching Commander Ross Carter mark up tactical maps with his red pen, every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings. The morning briefing. Room smelled of stale coffee and testosterone. 12 Navy SEALs clustered around the mission table, their conversation a mixture of professional assessment and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having failed at anything that mattered. They spoke in the shorthand of men who had worked together for years, finishing each other's sentences, communicating with glances and gestures that excluded everyone else in the room. Carter stood at the head of the table, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, pointing to a valley marked in red on the satellite photographs. The target was a supply route that intelligence claimed was lightly defended, suitable for rapid transit by a small convoy. 3 Humvees and 2 supply trucks. In and out before anyone noticed they were there. Terrain looks straightforward, Carter was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had run dozens of similar operations. Valley floor provides good mobility, exit routes on both ends. Intelligence confirms minimal enemy presence. We go in fast, establish the supply cache, and extract before anyone knows we were there. Dana studied the photographs with the eye of someone who had learned to read terrain like a survival manual. The valley was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, with steep ridges on both sides that provided perfect overwatch positions. Too many blind spots, too many places for an ambush, too perfect for anyone who wanted to trap a convoy with nowhere to run. She raised her hand, feeling the familiar weight of being the only woman in a room full of men who had already made up their minds about her capabilities. Sir, I'd recommend armor overwatch for this operation. 1 tank positioned on the high ground could provide insurance against. The laughter started before she finished the sentence. Not cruel, exactly, but the kind of dismissive chuckle you might give a child who suggested using a hammer to fix a computer. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Santos, Carter's second-in-command, actually smiled as he shook his head. Appreciate the offer, Captain, but tanks don't belong in that kind of terrain, Santos said, his tone patient but condescending. This is infantry country. We've been running operations like this since before GPS was reliable. The other SEALs nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from amused tolerance to outright dismissal. To them, she was a liaison officer, someone the Pentagon had attached to their unit for reasons that had more to do with paperwork than warfare. They saw the Army patch on her shoulder, the fact that she wasn't part of their tight-knit brotherhood, and assumed she didn't understand the realities of Special Operations. What they didn't see was the classified folder in her personnel file. 3 deployments in Iraq, commanding a tank platoon through urban warfare that had turned city blocks into killing fields. 2 tours in Afghanistan where she had learned that armor could go places everyone said it couldn't, do things everyone said it shouldn't. Her last deployment had been so classified, it didn't officially exist. Something involving Russian-made tanks and proxy forces in Syria, operations that never made it into after-action reports. Ma'am, Carter said, his voice carrying the kind of patient authority that made it clear the discussion was over. I understand your concerns, but this mission requires speed and stealth. Tanks are loud, slow, and they leave tracks that can be followed for weeks. What we need is surgical precision, not brute force. Dana felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level and professional. Commander, with respect, this valley has already claimed 2 previous operations. Alpha Company lost an entire squad here 3 months ago. Delta Force sent a reconnaissance team that simply vanished. Sometimes surgical precision isn't enough. The silence that followed was different from the earlier laughter. Carter's expression hardened slightly, and she could see the other SEALs exchanging glances that said everything about how they viewed challenges to their commander's authority. "Captain Reynolds," Carter said, and there was steel in his voice. "Now, those operations failed because they didn't have proper intelligence and planning. We do. The mission parameters are set, and they don't include armor support. Your role here is to observe and provide liaison coordination if needed. Nothing more." The dismissal was complete and professional, delivered without anger but with the kind of finality that ended conversations. Dana felt the familiar burn of frustration that came from being right about something and having no authority to act on it. She had seen this scenario play out before, in briefing rooms in command. Posts across 3 different war zones. Professional warriors making tactical decisions based on pride rather than prudence, convinced that their experience trumped everyone else's expertise. But what bothered her most wasn't the dismissal itself. It was the look in Carter's eyes when he mentioned the previous failed operations. For just a moment, she had seen something that looked like doubt, quickly buried beneath layers of command authority and unit pride. He knew the risks, understood the dangers, but he was committed to a plan that had been approved at levels far above. His pay grade died as the briefing broke up and the SEALs filed out to prepare their equipment. Dana remained in her seat, studying the satellite photographs that everyone else had dismissed as routine. The valley looked like a textbook example of an ambush site, the kind of terrain that armor officers learn to recognize in their first week of training. Narrow approaches, limited visibility, high ground on both flanks, and only 2 ways out. Intelligence suggested the area was controlled by a former Spetsnaz officer who had gone rogue, someone who understood American tactics well enough to turn them into death traps. The same intelligence that had missed 2 previous operations, getting wiped out in identical terrain. Santos paused on his way out, clapping her on the shoulder with the kind of casual familiarity that was meant to be reassuring but felt patronizing instead. "Don't worry about it, ma'am," he said, his smile genuine but entirely missing the point. "We've got this. Been running ops like this since before you were out of West Point." The assumption stung because it was so casually delivered, so completely confident in its own correctness. They saw her rank, her gender, her branch of service, and made assumptions about her experience that had nothing to do with reality. They didn't know about the night in Ramadi when she had driven her tank through 3 kilometers of enemy territory to extract 47 soldiers who were supposed to be acceptable losses. They didn't know about the classified operations in Syria, or the medal the Pentagon had given her in private and the desk job they had given her in public after the room emptied. Dana sat alone with the tactical maps, tracing the route with her finger and counting all the ways it could go wrong. Every veteran instinct she possessed was screaming warnings about this operation, but she was along for the ride, an observer with no authority to change anything, even when she could see disaster approaching with mathematical certainty. The worst part was the helplessness. In her own unit, commanding her own tank, she would have had options. Here, she was reduced to watching other people make mistakes she couldn't prevent, preparing to observe consequences she couldn't avoid. But as she folded up the maps and prepared to join the convoy, one thought kept echoing in her mind. Intelligence had reported minimal enemy presence and suitable terrain for rapid transit. The same intelligence that had been wrong twice before in the exact same location. Sometimes, Dana reflected, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one shooting at you. Sometimes it was the one who understood your tactics well enough to make you confident in your own destruction. The convoy rolled out at dawn. 3 Humvees and 2 supply trucks grinding over gravel that had been worn smooth by decades of conflict. Dana sat in the second vehicle, watching the landscape roll past through windows that were supposed to be bulletproof but had been tested too many times to inspire real confidence. The Eastern European Hills rose on either side like the walls of a grave, all jagged stone and scrub brush that looked like it had given up trying to grow. The morning mist hung in the valley like smoke in a closed room, thick and reluctant to move, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. Commander Carter rode in the lead vehicle, his shoulders tense in a way that had nothing to do with the rough road. 12 years of deployments had taught him to read terrain like a book, and Dana could see from his posture that this valley was telling him a story he didn't like. But he was committed to the mission, locked into a plan that had been approved at levels where changing course would require explanations no one wanted to give. Behind her, she could hear the quiet conversations of professional warriors doing what they did best, preparing for violence while hoping it wouldn't come. Equipment checks, ammunition counts, radio frequencies, the familiar ritual of men who had learned that attention to detail was the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. But something felt wrong about the silence outside the convoy. In her experience, valleys like this should have been alive with the sounds of morning, birds calling from the ridgelines, wind moving through the sparse vegetation, the distant echo of civilian activity. Instead, there was nothing but the mechanical growl of engines and the crunch of tires on stone. Dana pressed her palm against the window and studied the slopes with the kind of systematic attention that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. The silence bothered her more than gunfire would have. In Ramadi, she had learned to recognize the texture of an ambush before it happened. The way neighborhoods went quiet when everyone who lived there suddenly had somewhere else to be. She reached for the radio handset clipped to her vest, checking the frequency one more time before transmitting on the command net. All stations, this is Liaison. Recommend we halt and establish overwatch before proceeding into the Narrows. Carter's voice came back immediately, tolerant but firm, carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions before they could become arguments. Negative, Liaison. We're on schedule, and intelligence shows this route clear. Continue mission. Intelligence. Dana almost laughed at that. The same intelligence that had told them this valley was lightly defended and suitable for rapid transit. The same intelligence that had missed 2 previous operations, getting wiped out in identical terrain. The same intelligence that had somehow failed to notice that former Spetsnaz officers didn't usually set up shop in places where they couldn't control the tactical situation. But she wasn't in command here. She was along for the ride, an observer with no authority to change the mission, even when every veteran instinct she possessed was screaming warnings that seemed to get louder with every meter they traveled deeper into the valley. The first explosion came without warning. The lead Humvee vanished in a column of fire and smoke, flipped onto its side like a toy kicked by an angry child. The blast echoed off the valley walls, rolling back and forth until it became impossible to tell where the sound was coming from or when it would stop. But this wasn't a single improvised explosive device. The explosion was immediately followed by 2 more, perfectly timed charges that detonated under the 2nd and 4th vehicles in the convoy sequence. Someone had been watching them approach, calculating spacing and timing, waiting for the perfect moment to spring a trap that had been weeks in the planning. Dana's vehicle shuddered to a halt as automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 different elevations. Rifle fire from positions that had been invisible moments before, machine gun bursts that walked tracer rounds across the road surface, and the distinctive crack of sniper rifles, engaging from maximum range. This wasn't a hasty ambush thrown together by local insurgents. This was a professional military operation, coordinated and rehearsed, executed by people who understood American tactics well enough to anticipate every response. Carter's men reacted like the professionals they were, bailing out of their vehicles, with weapons raised, eyes scanning the ridgelines where muzzle flashes were already winking like deadly fireflies. But there was nowhere to go. The convoy was strung out on a road barely wide enough for two vehicles, trapped between walls of stone that might as well have been prison bars. Contact left, contact right. Santos was already laying down suppressive fire toward a cluster of boulders where he had spotted movement. "We're in a kill box." Dana dove from her vehicle as bullets shattered the windshield, rolling behind the engine block as automatic weapons fire chewed through the space where she had been sitting seconds before. Around her, she could hear the SEALs calling out targets, directions, ammunition counts, professional warriors doing what they did best while trapped inside a situation that had been designed by someone who understood exactly how they would react. The enemy fire came in overlapping waves, controlled bursts designed not to wipe them out quickly, but to keep them pinned down while exhaustion and ammunition shortage did the real killing. Dana could hear it in the pattern, the professional patience of fighters who knew time was on their side. That's when she understood what she was looking at. This wasn't a random ambush. This was a textbook L-shaped killing zone, perfectly positioned, with interlocking fields of fire and prepared positions that could hold down a force 3 times their size. Whoever had planned this had studied American tactics, understood how SEALs moved and reacted under pressure, and prepared accordingly. The second explosion took out the rear supply truck, cutting off their escape route and sending crates of ammunition tumbling into the road like oversized confetti. Now they were truly trapped, with no way forward and no way back, pinned down in the open with an enemy that held every advantage terrain could provide. Carter pressed himself against the twisted metal of his Humvee, trying to raise headquarters on the radio. Static filled the channel. He switched frequencies, tried again. More static. Someone was jamming their communications, cutting them off from air support, artillery, medevac. They were alone in this valley with an enemy that had planned for everything. One SEAL was down, clutching his shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. Another was dragging him toward better cover while bullets chipped stone inches from their heads. The professional confidence that had filled the briefing room that morning was evaporating under the reality of being outgunned, outmaneuvered, and completely cut off from support. That's when the loudspeaker crackled to life. The voice cut through the gunfire with electronic clarity, speaking English with a thick accent and the kind of deliberate precision that suggested the speaker had practiced this speech. "American soldiers, you are surrounded. Drop your weapons. Hands up. You have 1 minute." But it wasn't just the demand for surrender that sent ice through Dana's veins. It was what followed, broadcast with the casual precision of someone reading from an intelligence file. "Commander Ross Carter, service number 2847 Delta 7. Your wife Rebecca teaches 3rd grade at Coronado Elementary. Your daughter Emma plays soccer on Tuesdays." Carter's face went white. Around him, his men exchanged glances that said everything about how thoroughly their operational security had been compromised. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a message. The enemy knew who they were, knew their families, knew enough personal details to make surrender feel like the only option that didn't involve consequences reaching all the way back to San Diego. "Petty Officer Santos, your mother Maria lives on Alvarez Street in El Paso. She waters her garden every morning at 7. Santos's rifle wavered, his face twisting with a mixture of rage and fear that Dana had never seen in a professional warrior before. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, turning their greatest strength, their love for family, into their greatest weakness. The voice continued with satisfied precision. 60 seconds. Then we demonstrate what happens to those who resist. Your families will understand that you had choices to make." Dana watched Carter close his eyes for half a second, then open them and make the hardest decision of his career. In the calculus of special operations, some things were more important than personal honor. Some things were worth more than professional pride. "Weapons down," he said, his voice barely carrying over the gunfire. Then louder, with the kind of authority that had carried him through 12 years of impossible missions. "Stand down! Weapons down! That's an order." One by one, rifles began to lower. Professional warriors who had never surrendered in their lives slowly placed their weapons on the ground and raised their hands toward a sky that offered no salvation. The loudspeaker crackled with satisfaction. "Good. Very good. On your knees." That's when Dana Reynolds made her decision. While 12 SEALs knelt in the dirt with their hands raised in surrender, she was moving not away from the fight, but towards something Carter and his men couldn't see from their position. A shape hidden behind the smoke and debris of the destroyed supply truck, camouflaged and forgotten, but not destroyed. Her salvation was waiting in 30 tons of German steel, while 12 America's elite warriors knelt in the dust with their hands raised toward an enemy they couldn't see. Dana Reynolds moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned that survival often depended on noticing things other people missed. The destroyed supply truck was still burning, sending thick black smoke across the valley floor that provided perfect concealment for what she was really after. Behind the wreckage, covered by a camouflage net that had been half destroyed by the explosion, sat something that changed everything. A Leopard 2 main battle tank, 60 tons of German engineering, sitting silent and motionless like a sleeping giant. At first glance, it looked like another casualty of the ambush, its camouflage netting scorched and torn, its hull splattered with debris from the burning truck. But Dana's trained eye caught details that revealed a different story. The tank's main gun was undamaged, angled toward the eastern ridgeline, where most of the enemy fire was coming from. The tracks were intact, the armor showed no signs of penetration, and most importantly, there was no smoke rising from the engine compartment. This wasn't a destroyed vehicle. It was an abandoned one. She approached carefully, weapon ready, every sense alert for signs of enemy movement. The commander's hatch was open, revealing an interior that was dark as a cave mouth with no movement and no signs of life. When she reached the side of the tank and hauled herself up with movements her muscles remembered from another lifetime, she found the crew compartment empty except for evidence of what had happened here. Blood on the commander's seat, still tacky enough to be recent. On the floor of the fighting compartment, she found dog tags: Sergeant Klaus Waber, German Bundeswehr, and his crew of 3. The radio was still crackling with faint German voices, someone calling for Panzerwehr to respond, the desperate edge in their transmission suggesting they had been trying to raise this crew for some time. The story wrote itself in the evidence around her. The tank had been providing overwatch from this position when the ambush began. Exactly the kind of armor support she had recommended and Carter had dismissed. The crew had dismounted to investigate something, probably a false target designed to draw them out of their steel protection. Small arms fire from close range, coordinated and professional. The kind of tactic that required someone who understood how tank crews operated and knew their procedures well enough to exploit them. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a demonstration of how thoroughly their enemy had studied American and NATO tactics. Every aspect of this operation had been anticipated, planned for, countered. Every aspect except one. No one had planned for a tank crew to be replaced by someone who had learned to fight alone. Dana settled into the commander's position, her hands finding controls she hadn't touched in months but had never forgotten. Battery, switch, fuel pump, the low hum of electrical systems coming to life. The familiar sounds of a machine designed for one purpose, winning battles that couldn't be won any other way. She pressed the starter button, held her breath, and felt the massive diesel engine cough to life with a roar that shook the entire valley. The sound was unmistakable, impossible to ignore, the kind of mechanical thunder that announced to everyone within miles that something Fundamental had just changed about this battlefield. Down below, heads turned. SEALs who had been kneeling in surrender looked up in confusion and growing hope. Enemy fighters on the ridgelines paused mid-reload, trying to process what they were hearing. The sound of a main battle tank starting up in a place where no tank was supposed to be changed the tactical situation in an instant. Carter's voice crackled over the radio, disbelief and desperate hope fighting for control in his transmission. "What the hell? Who's in that tank?" Dana settled into the gunner's seat, her hands flying over controls she hadn't used since Syria, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. The autoloader cycled with a mechanical clank, feeding a high-explosive shell into the breech. She aligned the thermal sights, feeling the familiar weight of the main gun as it swiveled toward the ridgeline where the heaviest enemy fire was coming. From the enemy positions that had seemed so dominant moments before were suddenly exposed to a weapon they hadn't prepared for. Dana could see them through her thermal imaging, figures scrambling for better cover, weapons being repositioned, the controlled discipline of the ambush dissolving into the chaos of fighters who realized their perfect trap had just become their worst nightmare. "Steel doesn't surrender," she said into the radio, her voice calm as morning coffee, carrying a promise that was about to reshape this entire valley. The first shot lit up the valley like the end of the world. The 120mm shell screamed across the space between the tank and the enemy positions, covering the distance in less than 2 seconds before slamming into a technical truck mounted with a heavy machine gun. The vehicle disappeared in a fireball that painted the rocks orange and sent debris tumbling down the slope like deadly rain. But the enemy responded faster than she had expected, proving again that they were dealing with professionals who had prepared for multiple contingencies. A team with an anti-tank guided missile had been positioned for exactly this scenario, hidden in a cave system on the eastern ridge with a clear line of sight to the valley floor. The missile streaked down from the ridgeline, its guidance system locked onto the tank's heat signature, leaving a thin trail of smoke as it cut through the air toward her position. Dana saw it coming through her periscope, calculated trajectory and timing with the kind of split-second analysis that separated survivors from casualties. She slammed the tank into reverse, backing down the slope as fast as the Leopard's transmission could manage. The missile struck the rock face where she had been positioned seconds before, the explosion showering her vehicle with stone fragments that spiderwebbed the periscope glass, but left the armor intact. The echo of her cannon shot rolled through the valley, bouncing off stone walls and announcing to every fighter on both sides that the rules of engagement had just fundamentally changed. This was no longer an infantry ambush. This was tank versus infantry combat, and in that kind of fight, there was only one possible outcome. Carter was the first to understand the opportunity. He dove for his rifle, snatched it from the dirt where he had been forced to leave it, and chambered around with movements that spoke of pure muscle memory refined by years of training. "Weapons up!" he roared, his voice carrying across the valley, like a battle cry that turned defeat into defiance. "Get your weapons up! Fight!" The transformation was instantaneous. Men who had been kneeling in defeat surged to their feet, grabbing rifles, finding cover, returning fire with the kind of controlled fury that came from being humiliated and given a second chance at professional honor. Dana cycled the main gun, loaded another shell, and searched for her next target through thermal sights that revealed the enemy positions in perfect detail. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked down from the ridgeline, detonating against the tank's front armor in a shower of sparks and smoke that rattled her teeth, but left the Leopard's thick skin undamaged. She swiveled the turret, found the position where the RPG had originated, and put a high-explosive shell directly into the cave mouth. Rock dust and debris erupted into the air as tons of stone collapsed, burying the position and everyone in it. "Steel, this is Echo 1. Carter's voice over the radio was tight with adrenaline and something that might have been joy. "Beautiful shooting. Keep it coming." The momentum had shifted completely. What had been a massacre in progress was now a firefight, and in a straight firefight between American Special Operations Forces and anyone else. There had never been any doubt about the outcome, but Dana knew her limitations. She was operating alone, without a crew, handling jobs that normally required 4 people. Every shell she fired was one less in an ammunition count that had never been designed for extended combat. She had to make every shot count, had to end this fight before her advantages disappeared. The valley that had been filled with the controlled discipline of a professional ambush was now echoing with the sounds of that same discipline falling apart under pressure that had never been designed to handle Dot, and in the commander's seat of a German tank, Dana Reynolds was just getting started. The enemy fire was becoming more desperate now, less controlled, as fighters who had been comfortable in their prepared positions found themselves caught between tank fire from above and SEAL rifles from below. The careful ambush that had seemed so perfect was falling apart under pressure. It had never been designed to handle. Dana cycled through her thermal imaging modes, hunting for targets among the rocky outcroppings that lined the ridges. Through the green-tinted display, she could see enemy fighters abandoning their original positions, scrambling for better cover as the tactical situation collapsed around them. Santos led a charge up the left slope, his team providing covering fire while Kowalski, the unit medic, dragged their wounded SEAL to safety behind a boulder the size of a small building. The momentum had shifted completely from ambush to assault, from surrender to counterattack, but the enemy commander wasn't finished. Through her thermal sights, Dana caught movement in a cave system on the far ridge, figures repositioning with something large and cylindrical. Another anti-tank team, this one with a clear line of sight to her current position. She had maybe 30 seconds before they had her bracketed. "Echo 1, I need smoke on the eastern ridge," she called over the radio. "Add team moving to engage." Carter's response was immediate. "Copy that, Steele. Smoke out." White phosphorus grenades arced through the air, detonating in clouds of thick smoke that obscured the ridgeline. But Dana knew it was temporary cover at best. Modern anti-tank weapons could see through smoke like wasn't there, and these fighters had already proven they understood NATO equipment and tactics. She made a calculated gamble, gunning the tank forward and using the smoke as concealment to close the distance. The Leopard's tracks chewed through loose stone as she climbed directly toward the enemy position. It was the last thing they would expect, a tank charging uphill into prepared anti-tank positions. The second missile launch came from her left flank, a position she hadn't spotted. The projectile slammed into the tank's side armor with a sound like the world ending. Interior lights flickered, warning alarms screamed, and Dana tasted blood where she had bitten her tongue on impact. But German steel held against Russian ordnance, and the Leopard kept climbing. Dana put her third shell into a bunker that had been harassing Carter's right flank, watching the position disappear in smoke and falling stone. The enemy's return fire was sporadic now, uncoordinated. Men were breaking cover, running for positions deeper in the hills, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape. "Echo 1 to Steele," Carter's voice over the radio carried a note of disbelief. "We've got them on the run." Outstanding work, but it wasn't over yet. Through her periscope, Dana could see muzzle flashes from a cave mouth high on the eastern ridge, a position that commanded the entire valley. That's where their commander would be, the former Spetsnaz officer who had planned this ambush, who had studied American tactics and prepared accordingly. She swiveled the main gun, taking her time, adjusting for elevation and wind. This shot had to be perfect, not just to end the fight, but to send a message that would echo through these hills long after the last shell casing stopped rolling. The shell left the barrel with a crack that seemed to split the sky. It arced through the air, a streak of metal and high explosive, and punched into the cave mouth with surgical precision. The explosion lit up the ridge like a second sunrise, rock face cracking, tons of stone cascading down the slope, an avalanche that buried everything beneath it. Silence fell over the valley, like a curtain dropping on the final act of a violent play. No more gunfire, no more shouting, just the tick of cooling metal and the distant rumble of rocks still settling into new positions. Carter's voice came over the radio. Quiet now, almost reverent. Valley secure, all enemy positions neutralized. Dana sat back in the gunner's seat, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Around her, the tank's hull ticked as it cooled, filled with the smell of cordite and hot metal that would linger in her uniform for days. Through the periscope, she could see Carter's men moving among the wreckage, securing the area, checking on their wounded. They moved with the controlled precision of professionals, but there was something different in their posture now, a respect that hadn't been there during the morning briefing. She had done it. One woman, one tank, against an enemy that had held every advantage except the will to face 60 tons of German steel operated by someone who refused to accept defeat. The radio crackled with activity as Carter coordinated casualty reports and called for medical evacuation. One SEAL with a shoulder wound, another with shrapnel cuts, but everyone was alive and mobile. The kind of outcome that would have been impossible 30 minutes earlier, when surrender had seemed like the only option that kept their families safe. Dana climbed out of the commander's hatch, into morning air that tasted of smoke and victory. The valley that had seemed like a death trap was now just another piece of ground held by American forces, marked by the scattered debris of an enemy that had underestimated what could happen when professional training met absolute determination. Carter was waiting for her at the base of the tank, his uniform torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood that wasn't his own. Behind him, his men had formed up in a loose semicircle, their expressions mixing exhaustion with something that looked like awe. These were operators who had fought in a dozen countries, men who had earned their reputations in places where reputation was the difference between life and death. They had started the morning treating her like excess baggage, a liaison officer whose only job was to stay out of the way. Now they stood in something approaching formation, waiting to hear what their commander would say to the woman who had saved their lives. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything that had just happened and everything that would never be spoken about in official reports. In this valley, among these men, there would always be one truth that mattered more than mission briefings or chain of command protocols. They had been saved by steel and the woman who knew how to make it sing. "We had our weapons down," Carter said finally, his voice quiet but carrying across the valley floor to every member of his team. Every rifle in the dirt, hands in the air. He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between professional humiliation and professional gratitude, between the dismissal he had given her that morning and the debt he owed her now. "You could have stayed hidden, stayed safe. Let us handle our own consequences." Dana looked at the faces around her, studying the expressions of men who had been prepared to die rather than live with the shame of surrender. Santos with a field dressing around his arm where shrapnel had found gaps in his armor. Kowalski, still blood-splattered from treating the wounded, his medic's instincts having kept him moving through the firefight even when bullets were chipping stone around his head. She understood what Carter was really saying. In their world, being saved was almost as hard to live with as being captured, especially when the salvation came from someone they had dismissed as irrelevant to their mission. "Steel doesn't kneel," she said simply, then added something that surprised even herself. "And neither do the people who know how to use it." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after her last shell had landed. This was the kind of quiet that came when professionals recognized something in each other that went beyond rank or service branch or official mission statements. Santos appeared at Carter's shoulder, producing a spare seal trident patch from his kit. Without a word, he walked to the tank and slapped it against the scorched armor, pressing it flat against the steel with the palm of his hand. "That's yours now," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a brotherhood that didn't often extend beyond their own ranks. "Don't let anyone tell you different." The other SEALs gathered around, men who had started the morning dismissing her as an unnecessary liaison, who had ended it watching her tear apart an enemy ambush with precision fire and sheer determination. No one spoke, but their faces said everything about how completely their assumptions had been shattered. One by one, they approached the tank, touching the armor with the kind of reverence usually reserved for monuments to fallen heroes. This machine had saved their lives, and the woman who had operated it had earned something that couldn't be granted through official channels or written into fitness reports. "Dana," Carter said, using her first name for the first time, "I owe you an apology, and a lot more than that." He paused, looking back at the valley where 12 men had learned something about assumptions and the people who make them, about the danger of underestimating anyone based on their job description or the patch on their shoulder. "That liaison assignment you're on," he continued, his voice carrying the kind of insight that came from having his own assumptions proven spectacularly wrong. "I'm guessing it wasn't exactly voluntary." She turned to look at him, this professional warrior who had learned something about humility in the space between surrender and salvation. "Command doesn't like officers who think outside the box," she said, "especially when thinking outside the box involves disobeying direct orders to save people who were supposed to be acceptable losses." "Well," Carter said, a slight smile breaking through the dirt and exhaustion on his face, "after today, I'm thinking Command might want to reconsider what constitutes thinking outside the box." The sound of approaching helicopters cut through their conversation, the distinctive whop-whop of rotors echoing off the valley walls. Medical evacuation for the wounded, extraction for the team, and eventually, a recovery crew for the tank that had changed everything. But before the official world intruded with its reports and debriefings, there was this moment. 12 elite warriors acknowledging that their lives had been saved by someone they had never bothered to really see, someone whose expertise they had dismissed without consideration. Kowalski, the medic, stepped forward with something in his hand. A combat medical badge, the kind awarded to medics who had proven themselves under fire. He held it out to Dana with the solemnity of a medal ceremony. "You saved more lives today than most medics see in a career," he said quietly. "This belongs with someone who understands what it means to bring people home." Dana accepted the badge, feeling its weight in her palm. Not because of the medal itself, but because of what it represented. Recognition from professionals who measured worth in results, not rhetoric. The helicopters were getting closer now, their sound mixing with the distant crackle of fire still burning among the enemy positions. Soon this valley would be filled with investigators, intelligence analysts, and report writers who would try to capture what had happened here in language suitable for official consumption. But the real story would never make it into those reports. The real story was written in the faces of 12 men who had learned that survival sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. And that expertise didn't always wear the uniform you expected. Santos checked his weapon one final time, then looked back at the tank that had become their salvation. "What are you going to tell them?" he asked, nodding toward the approaching helicopters. "About how this went down?" Dana considered the question, knowing that her answer would shape not just the official record, but her own future in a military that didn't always appreciate unconventional solutions to conventional problems. "I'm going to tell them that when Americans are in trouble, other Americans step up," she said finally. "Regardless of branch, regardless of mission parameters, regardless of who thought it was a good idea. Carter nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for further explanation. I'm going to tell them that armor support saved this mission, and that anyone who thinks tanks don't belong in infantry operations needs to spend some time in a valley like this one. The first helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, medical personnel jumping out before the skids had fully settled. The official world was reasserting itself, bringing with it all the protocols and procedures that would transform their shared experience into paperwork. But as Dana watched the medics work on Santos and the other wounded, she knew that something had changed here that went beyond mission success or tactical innovation. 12 men who had started the day treating her like an afterthought would spend the rest of their careers telling a different story about assumptions and expertise and the danger of dismissing people based on incomplete information. The tank loomed behind her, scarred but standing, its barrel still angled toward ground it had claimed through violence and will. 3 missile impacts, dozens of small arms hits, and a combat record that would follow it for the rest of its service life. Carter approached as the medical helicopters lifted off with their wounded, disappearing over the ridgeline toward better medical facilities than the valley could provide. You know, this changes things, he said, his voice serious. Word's going to get out about what happened here, about what you did. Dana looked at him, this professional warrior who had been forced to confront his own assumptions about capability and worth. Good, she said. Maybe next time someone suggests armor support, it won't get laughed out of the briefing room. Next time, Carter said, I'm going to make sure the person suggesting it is someone who knows how to use it. The recovery helicopters were approaching now, heavy-lift aircraft capable of carrying the tank back to base where it would be repaired, refitted, and eventually returned to service. But it would carry with it a story that would be told in maintenance bays and motor pools for years to come. As the recovery crew prepared their equipment, Dana took one last look around the valley that had tested everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the military hierarchy. The enemy positions were silent now, their occupants either dead or fled. Their carefully planned ambush turned into a demonstration of what could happen when professional training met. Absolute determination. She climbed back into the tank one final time, not to fight, but to guide it onto the recovery platform that would carry it home. The controls felt familiar under her hands, the machine responding to her touch like an old friend who had shared something important. The official reports would never mention her name, would attribute the victory to combined arms coordination and fortunate positioning of Allied assets. But in this valley, among these men, there would always be one truth that mattered more than official records. They had been saved by steel, and the woman who knew how to make it sing. 3 days later, Dana sat in a sterile conference room at Ford, operating Base Blackwater, facing a panel of officers whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. The after-action review was supposed to be routine, a standard debrief following a successful mission. But the presence of a full colonel she didn't recognize, along with 2 majors from intelligence and a captain from the Judge Advocate General's office, suggested that routine had left the building somewhere around the time she had fired her first tank round. Colonel William Morrison, the base commander, sat at the head of the table with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of 30 years. In uniform and very little patience for explanations that didn't fit neatly into established protocols. His gray hair was regulation short, his uniform bore enough ribbons to stock a small parade, and his eyes held the flat intensity of someone who had built his career on following orders and expecting others to do the same. Captain Reynolds, Morrison began, his voice carrying the kind of formal authority that turned conversations into interrogations. Let's start with your understanding of your role in Operation Valley Transit. Dana kept her voice level and professional, despite the growing certainty that this wasn't going to be the kind of debrief where successful outcomes trump procedural concerns. Sir, I was assigned as liaison officer for coordination between Army and Navy units. My orders specified observation and communication support as needed. Major Patricia Hayes from Intelligence leaned forward, consulting a tablet that probably contained every detail of Dana's military record, including the classified operations that weren't supposed to exist in official documents. Captain, your orders made no mention of combat operations or independent tactical action, Hayes said, her tone suggesting that unauthorized initiative was somehow worse than allowing American forces to be captured or killed. Can you explain why you chose to engage enemy forces without explicit authorization from the mission commander? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, carrying implications that went far beyond tactical decisions made under fire. Dana understood what was really being asked here and what was really at stake. Ma'am, when I observed American forces under imminent threat of capture or execution, I used available resources to provide immediate support, she said carefully. The tank was abandoned, the crew was casualties, and the tactical situation required immediate action to prevent loss of American lives. Captain James Rodriguez from the JAG office spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of legalistic precision that turned combat into courtroom evidence. Captain Reynolds, taking control of foreign military equipment without proper authorization raises significant questions about chain of command and international law. The Leopard tank belonged to German forces operating under separate command. Authority. Dana felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice steady. Sir, the German crew were casualties. The tank was abandoned. American forces were facing imminent capture. Under the circumstances, I believed immediate action was both necessary and appropriate. Morrison's expression hadn't changed throughout the exchange, but Dana could see something in his eyes that looked like disappointment mixed with bureaucratic frustration. This was a man who understood combat, who had probably made similar decisions under fire during his own career, but who was now constrained by the kind of institutional thinking that valued process over results. Captain, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of final authority, successful outcome aside, your actions raise serious questions about adherence to command structure and mission parameters. Commander Carter was the designated mission. Commander, the decision to engage was his to make, not yours. Sir, Dana replied, knowing she was walking into dangerous territory, but unable to let the statement pass unchallenged. Commander Carter had been forced to surrender. His men had laid down their weapons. The tactical situation had changed beyond the scope of the original mission parameters. Major Hayes consulted her tablet again, her expression suggesting she had found something particularly damning in the digital record of events. Captain Reynolds, communication logs show that Commander Carter explicitly denied your request for armor support during the pre-mission briefing. Your subsequent actions appear to contradict his tactical assessment and command authority. The accusation was delivered with clinical precision, but Dana could hear the real message beneath the formal language. She had been insubordinate, had acted outside her authority, had potentially compromised international relations by commandeering foreign equipment. Ma'am, Dana said, feeling the careful control she had maintained beginning to slip. Commander. Carter's tactical assessment was based on intelligence that proved to be fatally flawed. The enemy had prepared specifically for conventional infantry tactics. Without armor support, the entire unit would have been captured or killed. Morrison raised his hand, cutting off further discussion with the kind of gesture that ended debates. By administrative fiat, Captain Reynolds, the outcome of the mission is not in question. Your men performed admirably under difficult circumstances. However, the means by which that outcome was achieved raises concerns that extend beyond tactical success. Dana felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized where this conversation was heading. This wasn't about tactical decisions or mission success. This was about institutional control, about maintaining the kind of hierarchical order that couldn't tolerate unauthorized initiative, even when that initiative saved lives. "Sir," she said, making one final attempt to appeal to the combat experience she knew Morrison possessed. 12 American warriors went home to their families because of actions taken in that valley. Surely that outcome justifies the means used. To achieve it, Morrison's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Dana thought she saw recognition in his eyes, the understanding of one combat veteran for another. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of institutional authority that transcended personal understanding. "Captain Reynolds, the military operates on discipline, hierarchy, and adherence to lawful orders. When individual officers begin making independent tactical decisions based on their personal assessment of changing circumstances, the entire command structure is undermined." Major Hayes leaned forward again, her tablet displaying what looked like official correspondence. "Captain, there are also questions about your previous disciplinary actions. The incident in Syria, where you disobeyed direct orders to abandon the surrounded unit, resulted in official reprimand and reassignment to liaison duties." The words hit Dana like physical blows, each one calculated to reduce her from a combat veteran who had saved lives to a problem officer who couldn't follow orders. She understood now that this review had been predetermined, that the questions were formalities designed to support conclusions that had already been reached. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest, "in Syria, I saved 47 soldiers who command had written off as acceptable losses. Today, I saved 12 more. If saving American lives is considered insubordination, then I accept that charge." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of helicopters operating somewhere else on the base. Morrison's expression had hardened again, and Dana could see that her honesty had only confirmed what he had already decided. "Captain Reynolds," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the finality of military justice, effective immediately, "you are relieved of all operational duties pending formal review of your actions. You will report to the base legal office for processing of administrative actions related to your unauthorized use of German military equipment and violation of established command protocols." Dana felt the words wash over her like cold water, understanding that her military career was effectively over, ended not by enemy action but by institutional inability to tolerate success achieved through unauthorized means. But as she stood to leave, facing the end of everything she had worked for since graduating from West Point, one thought echoed in her mind with absolute clarity. 12 men were alive because she had refused to let institutional protocol take precedence over human lives. And regardless of what happened to her career, that truth would remain unchanged. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not against enemy forces, but against the systems that valued procedure over people, process over results, conformity over courage. And sometimes winning those battles came at a price that only the person paying it could truly understand. The formal hearing convened a week later in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom than a military facility. Dana sat at a small table facing a panel of 5 officers, their collective rank insignia representing enough authority to end not just her career, but her entire future in uniform. Behind her, the gallery was empty except for a single figure she hadn't expected to see. Commander Ross Carter sat in the back row, his dress uniform perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met briefly, he gave her a small nod that might have been encouragement or simply acknowledgement. Colonel Morrison presided over the proceedings with the kind of formal dignity that turned human decisions into administrative actions. The charges were read with bureaucratic precision: unauthorized use of foreign military equipment, failure to follow lawful orders, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Each charge carried the weight of career destruction, the kind of administrative death sentence that would follow her long after she returned to civilian life. But as Dana listened to the formal language that reduced her actions to violations of protocol, she felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in years, she was going to be able to tell the complete truth without worrying about classification, levels, or operational security, or the delicate diplomatic relationships that constrained military honesty. "Captain Reynolds," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of final judgment, "you have the right to present testimony in your own defense. How do you plead to the charges as read?" Dana stood, feeling the weight of her dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest representing deployments and actions that had brought her to this moment. "Sir, I plead guilty to all charges as stated." The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the panel. Guilty pleas in military hearings were usually accompanied by requests for mercy, explanations of mitigating circumstances, appeals to the understanding of fellow warriors who had faced similar impossible choices. "Captain," Morrison said, his eyebrows raised slightly, "do you understand the implications of your plea? The potential consequences to your military career and future prospects?" "Yes, sir, I do," Dana replied, her voice steady and clear. "I understand that using that tank without authorization violated established protocols. I understand that engaging enemy forces without explicit permission from the mission commander contradicted chain of command principles. I understand that my actions created diplomatic complications with our German allies." She paused, looking directly at each member of the panel, making sure they understood that her next words were delivered with full knowledge of their consequences. "But I also understand that 12 American warriors went home to their families because someone was willing to violate those protocols when human lives were at stake." Major Hayes leaned forward, her expression suggesting that Dana's honesty was somehow making the situation worse rather than better. "Captain Reynolds, do you believe that individual officers should be permitted to make independent tactical decisions based on their personal assessment of changing circumstances?" It was the core question, the one that struck at the heart of military discipline and institutional control. Dana had known it was coming, had prepared for it during the long nights when sleep was interrupted by memories of that valley and the choices she had made there. "Ma'am," Dana said, her voice carrying the weight of 8 years in combat zones, "I believe that when American lives are at immediate risk, and when established command authority has been compromised, individual officers have a responsibility that transcends normal protocol, even when that individual assessment contradicts the tactical judgment of the designated mission commander." Hayes pressed. "Especially then," Dana replied, knowing that her answer was sealing her fate but unable to provide any other response that would allow her to live with herself. "Because sometimes the mission commander is operating on flawed intelligence, or facing threats that weren't anticipated in the original planning, or constrained by political considerations that don't apply to immediate tactical realities." The hearing room fell silent except for the scratch of pens on paper as the panel members made notes that would become part of the official record. Dana could see that her honesty was being documented as evidence of her unfitness for continued military service. That's when Carter stood up. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying across the room with the kind of authority that made everyone present turn to look at him, "I request permission to provide testimony relevant to this hearing." Morrison's expression showed surprise mixed with annoyance. "Commander Carter, this hearing concerns Captain Reynolds' actions, not your tactical decisions. Your testimony is not required." "Sir," Carter replied, his voice respectful but firm, "I believe my testimony is directly relevant to the question of whether Captain Reynolds' actions were necessary and appropriate under the circumstances." Morrison consulted briefly with the other panel members. Their whispered conversation too quiet to overhear, but obviously focused on the complications that additional testimony might create. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "Commander Carter, you may provide relevant testimony. Please confine your remarks to facts directly related to the charges against Captain Reynolds." Carter moved to the front of the room, taking a position beside Dana that felt more like reinforcement than coincidence. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet intensity of someone who had spent the past week thinking very carefully about what he was going to say. "Sir, the intelligence briefing for Operation Valley Transit indicated minimal enemy presence and terrain suitable for rapid convoy transit. That intelligence was wrong on both counts. The enemy force we encountered was professional, well-equipped, and had prepared specifically for American tactical responses." He paused, making eye contact with each panel member in turn. The ambush was perfect. Interlocking fields of fire, prepared positions, communications jamming, and psychological warfare. Techniques designed to force surrender rather than resistance. My unit was completely compromised within minutes of initial contact. Major Hayes interrupted, her tone suggesting that Carter's testimony was straying into areas better left unexplored. "Commander, the tactical situation is not in question. What is in question is Captain Reynolds' unauthorized actions in response to that situation." "Ma'am," Carter replied, his voice taking on an edge that suggested he had reached the limits of diplomatic patience. "Captain Reynolds' actions were the only reason any of us survived that valley. Without her intervention, 12 members of an elite special operations unit would have been captured or executed by enemy forces." "Commander," Morrison said, his voice carrying a warning that suggested Carter was approaching dangerous territory, "Captain Reynolds was not authorized to take independent tactical action." "The chain of command, sir," Carter interrupted, his voice now carrying the kind of passion that transformed testimony into advocacy. "The chain of command had been broken. My men had been forced to surrender. Our weapons were on the ground. Our hands were in the air, and our families were being threatened by an enemy that knew our personal details." The room fell absolutely silent as Carter's words hit the panel like physical blows. The implication was clear. The formal protocols that governed military operations had failed catastrophically, leaving individual initiative as the only option between survival and destruction. "In that situation," Carter continued, his voice steady but intense, "Captain Reynolds did what every military officer swears to do. She protected American lives using whatever means were available. The fact that those means violated normal protocol is less important than the fact that they succeeded in saving American lives." Morrison's expression had hardened throughout Carter's testimony, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of institutional authority that brooked no contradiction. "Commander Carter, your loyalty to the officer who saved your unit is commendable, but it does not change the fundamental question of military discipline and adherence to lawful orders." Carter looked directly at Morrison, his expression showing the kind of resolve that had carried him through 12 years of impossible missions. "Sir, with respect, sometimes discipline means knowing when to break the rules in order to serve the larger purpose those rules were designed to protect." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either understanding or explosion. Dana could see the conflict playing out in Morrison's expression, the tension between institutional requirements and combat reality, between administrative convenience and moral truth. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define not just Dana's future, but the precedent for how the military would handle similar situations in years to come. "Captain Reynolds, Commander Carter, the panel will recess to consider all testimony presented. You will be notified of our decision within 24 hours." As the panel filed out, Carter turned to Dana with an expression that mixed determination with something that looked like apology. "I should have listened to you during the briefing," he said quietly. "My pride almost got my men killed, and now my testimony might not be enough to save your career." Dana looked at this professional warrior who had been willing to risk his own standing to defend her actions, understanding that some bonds were forged in combat and couldn't be broken by administrative proceedings. "You did listen," she said. "When it mattered most, you heard what I was really saying. That's more than most people manage." Outside the hearing room, the base continued its normal operations, unaware that inside a sterile conference room, too, combat veterans had just challenged the fundamental assumptions about how the military balanced individual initiative against institutional control. The decision, when it came, would reveal whether courage in combat was valued more than conformity. In peacetime, whether saving lives mattered more than following protocols. Whether the military was an institution that learned from its warriors or simply processed them according to predetermined guidelines. 24 hours would determine not just Dana's future, but the future of every officer who might someday face the choice between following orders and saving lives. Dana woke before dawn, her internal clock refusing to acknowledge that her military career might be ending in a few hours. She dressed in her service uniform one final time, each ribbon and decoration a small memorial to deployments and operations that had brought her to this moment of institutional reckoning. The base was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, with only the essential personnel and security forces moving through the corridors that had become as familiar as home during her months of liaison duty. Soon, regardless of the panel's decision, she would be leaving this world behind, either for a new assignment that reflected her diminished status or for civilian life, but she hadn't prepared herself to imagine at precisely 0800 hours. She reported to the conference room where her future would be determined by 5 officers who had never seen her operate a tank under fire, never watched her make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between American casualties and American victories. Colonel Morrison entered with the rest of the panel, their expressions revealing nothing about the deliberations that had consumed the previous 18 hours. The formal proceedings resumed with the kind of military precision that turned human lives into administrative actions. "Captain Reynolds," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "this panel has carefully considered all testimony and evidence related to the charges against you. We have also consulted with higher headquarters regarding the precedent that our decision will establish for similar situations in the future." Dana stood at attention, feeling the weight of her uniform and everything it represented, knowing that within minutes she might be required to remove it forever. "The charges against you are serious," Morrison continued, his expression giving no hint of the decision to come. "Unauthorized use of foreign military equipment, failure to follow lawful orders, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline represent fundamental violations of military law and protocol." He paused, and in that silence Dana could hear the distant sound of helicopters conducting training operations, the normal rhythm of military life that would continue regardless of what happened to one captain who had chosen to fight when fighting wasn't authorized. "However," Morrison said, and that single word changed everything about the tone and direction of his remarks, "this panel has also considered the extraordinary circumstances that led to those violations, the lives that were saved as a direct result of your actions, and the testimony of Commander Carter regarding the tactical realities you faced in that valley." Major Hayes leaned forward, consulting the official documentation that would become part of Dana's permanent record. "Captain Reynolds, while this panel cannot overlook the serious nature of your protocol violations, we also cannot ignore the fact that your actions resulted in the successful completion of the mission and the preservation of American lives under circumstances where traditional command authority had been compromised. Dana felt something shift in her chest, hope beginning to compete with resignation. Though she kept her expression neutral and professional, Morrison stood, his voice taking on the formal tone of official pronouncement. Therefore, this panel finds you guilty of the charges as specified, but recommends clemency based on the extraordinary circumstances and successful outcome of your actions. The words hit Dana like a physical force, relief and disbelief competing for dominance in her emotional response. Guilty, but with clemency, it meant her career would survive, though probably with conditions and restrictions that would limit her future opportunities. Captain Reynolds, Morrison continued, you will receive an official reprimand that will become part of your permanent record. You will also be required to complete additional training in command authority and joint operations protocols. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something that might have been respect mixed with institutional warning. However, in light of your exceptional performance under combat conditions and the recommendation of Commander Carter, you are being reassigned to the Army's Armor School as an instructor in combined arms operations. Dana felt the room spin slightly, as the implications of the decision settled in her mind. Not just survival, but assignment to a position where her experience could be used to train the next generation of officers, who might someday face similar impossible choices. Sir, she said, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring beneath her professional composure, I understand and accept the panel's decision. Morrison's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the understanding of one combat veteran for another. Captain Reynolds, the military depends on officers who can think independently under fire, who can adapt to changing circumstances, and who place the welfare of their soldiers above their own career prospects. He looked directly at her, his gray eyes holding recognition that transcended rank and institutional politics. Your actions in that valley demonstrated all of those qualities, even while violating the protocols designed to maintain good order and discipline. This panel believes that the military is stronger when it includes officers like you, even when those officers occasionally color outside the lines. Major Hayes added, your new assignment will include developing training scenarios based on your experience with improvised armor operations and combined arms coordination under extreme circumstances. The lessons you learned in that valley need to be shared with officers who may face similar situations in the future. As the formal proceedings concluded and the panel members began filing out, Carter approached Dana with an expression that mixed relief with something that looked like vindication. Congratulations, he said, extending his hand in a gesture that felt more like recognition between equals than acknowledgement of rank. The Armor School is lucky to get you. Thank you, Dana replied, understanding that his testimony had been the difference between career destruction and career survival. I owe you more than I can repay. You don't owe me anything, Carter said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned important lessons about assumptions and expertise. What you did in that valley wasn't about rank or branch of service or chain of command. It was about Americans taking care of Americans when everything else had failed. As they walked out of the conference room together, Dana reflected on the strange path that had brought her from tank commander to liaison officer to instructor, each transition forced by circumstances beyond her control, but somehow leading to opportunities she could never have planned. The official reports would document her protocol violations and the clemency that had preserved her career. But the real story would be told in classrooms at the Armor School, where future officers would learn about the day when conventional tactics failed and individual initiative succeeded, when following orders would have meant accepting defeat, and breaking orders meant bringing people home. 6 months later, Captain Dana Reynolds stood before a classroom of lieutenant colonels and majors, officers who had been selected for advanced training in combined arms operations. Behind her, A large screen displayed satellite photographs of an Eastern European valley that had become a case study in adaptive tactics and individual initiative. Today, we're going to discuss what happens when your perfect plan meets an enemy who has studied your tactics and prepared accordingly, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the lessons she was teaching. We're going to talk about the moment when protocol becomes secondary to results, when individual judgment becomes more important than institutional procedure, and when the willingness to break rules becomes the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The officers in the classroom leaned forward with the attention of professionals who understood that the lessons about to be shared had been paid for in blood and validated by survival. But most importantly, Dana continued, her voice carrying across the room to every officer who might someday face impossible choices, we're going to talk about the principle that has guided American warriors for more than 2 centuries, that steel doesn't surrender, and neither do the people who know how to use it. Outside the classroom, the base continued its normal operations, training the next generation of warriors who would carry forward the lessons learned in the valley, where 12 men had knelt in surrender until one woman decided that surrender was not an option. The tank that had saved them sat in the Armor Museum now, its scarred hull bearing the sealed trident patch that had been welded into place as a permanent reminder of what could happen when professional training met absolute determination. And in classrooms across the military education system, the story was being told and retold, each version emphasizing the same fundamental truth, that sometimes the most important battles are won not by following the plan, but by having the courage to improvise when the plan fails. Because in the end, wars are won not by institutions or protocols or carefully crafted strategies, but by individual warriors who refuse to accept defeat, even when defeat appears to be the only rational option. Steel doesn't surrender, and neither do the people who understand that principle when it matters most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.